Good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. I'd like to thank our sponsors, PSSI, for coordinating this conference, in particular Yana Robinson for all her hard work in organizing this. I'd like to thank you for being here. We think this is a really important discussion, and Secure World is very proud and happy to be part of this conversation. So we're kicking off the conversation looking at the evolution of the counterspace threat. Space security is becoming increasingly a salient space policy issue. Over the last several years, there's been growing concern from multiple governments over the reliance on vulnerable space capabilities for national security and the corresponding proliferation of offensive counterspace capabilities that could be used to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy space systems. This, in turn, has led to increased rhetoric from some countries about the need to prepare for future conflicts on Earth to extend into space, and calls from some corners to increase the development of offensive counterspace capabilities and put in place more aggressive policies and postures. So therefore, a more open and public debate on these issues is urgently needed, such as what we're going to be having today. Space is not the sole domain of militaries and intelligence services. Our global society and economy is increasingly dependent on space capabilities. And a future conflict in space would have massive, long-term negative repercussions that are felt here on Earth. Even testing these capabilities could have long-lasting negative repercussions for the space environment and all who operate there. So we need to be aware of the developing threats and risk of different options, as would be the case for other national security issues in the air, land, and sea domains. So today's discussion will look at the evolution of these counterspace threats. Our panelists will discuss the current status of these capabilities, talk about how they've evolved over the years, and look at possible solutions to help make sure this domain is secure, sustainable, and usable over the long term. We're just going to go down the line. We're going to have our speakers give each about 5 or 7 minutes of opening remarks. We'll have time for questions at the end, and with that, I'm going to start with Jamie Warren. And we've got our bios and the documents, so I'm not going to bother reading it out. Go for it.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Victoria said, I'm Jamie Morin with Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. For those of you that might be unfamiliar with aerospace, we were created by the U.S. Air Force about 60 years ago to provide them with technical advice from an independent, nonprofit perspective as they conceived the initial military and intelligence space programs for the United States. And since then, we've grown to work with civil space, NASA, as well as in some commercial players, and increasingly are engaged in the kind of international partnership activity that is one of the key themes of this conference. I lead the Center for Space Policy and Strategy there, and in an organization, Aerospace, which is 4,000 people, the vast majority of whom are engineers and scientists, the policy and strategy component is really about ensuring that the initial concepts for acquisition programs and for efforts in space are well-founded, and doing independent analysis to ensure that. So at a time when the U.S. government and allies are so intensely focused on adapting to a rapidly changing space environment, these kinds of questions come up continually, and that's why we're really glad for the opportunity to be part of today's conversation. As I look at the space domain, and as we focus the efforts of our center, we look at 4 big trends that are underway, many of which folks in this room are familiar with. The first is the democratization of space, and what we've heard already in the opening comments today really gets to this question of many new actors, commercial, national, many new actors bringing new sets of norms, a new sense of what the rules of the road are. That democratization trend shapes the security sector as well as the commercial sector. A second is the crowding, and while space is large, we are starting in terms of electromagnetic spectrum and in terms of the debris and active satellite environment to see, at least in the distant, in sort of our distant vision, we're starting to see the limits. And that's why work on long-term sustainability and both governmental and private sector-led efforts to focus on ensuring the sustainability of the domain are so important. So that's a second theme. A third theme is the contestation theme, and again, particularly in our work with U.S. government and key allies and partners, that comes to the fore, and I think we're going to discuss that quite a bit today, and I have a few thoughts I'll share. And then the fourth is there's a whole host of game-changing technologies coming forward that question or upend assumptions that we began our space endeavors believing were always true. And that, I won't get into all of the many ones, but it is a fascinating series of injections of technology. My center has had the opportunity to publish, I think, about 40 to 50 studies addressing these themes over the last 2.5 to 3 years. And so I'd commend them to you, certainly. But the grappling at how much this is changing the space domain. If we think specifically about Counterspace and the goals of this panel, what I'd like to do is draw a few threads of what Counterspace technology is, what it means strategically. And I think the place to start for that is with a bit of a typology. In recent weeks and months, public dialogue about the Counterspace environment has advanced quite a bit with a number of publications. We've heard reference already to the Secure World Foundation's second annual edition of their Counterspace study, which, if you have not read it, is extraordinarily comprehensive and sophisticated in its reading of the open source literature. That injection into the dialogue, another study done in the US by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and two significant published documents by elements of the US intelligence community, one by NASIC and one by the Defense Intelligence Agency, have, I think, dramatically changed the common set of facts and set of observations that characterize the Counterspace domain. Each one of these studies has a little bit of a different perspective in terms of categorizing Counterspace activity and making sense of it. Personally, for myself, I think of these technologies in a framework that is designed to get at what is their strategic interaction with one another. How do they play in the global environment? And so for me, it's a three-level set of types, which begins with the question of from where is the Counterspace effect produced, and then moves to with what sort of phenomenon, and then goes to how long does the effect last. So the from where, we can produce Counterspace effects from the Earth, obviously the most common, and we see them regularly in conflict and also in peacetime, is jamming of either communications or position, navigation, and timing services. But we also know that there are more destructive and permanent effects that can be produced from the surface of the Earth, for example, with direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, and we've seen a number of tests along those lines in recent years. So that first question is from where? And it matters because of the political and psychological impact of producing effects either from the Earth or in space, and the counteractions that might be taken. That second question is with what? And the Defense Intelligence Agency and NASIC reports are actually quite transparent in laying out the sort of activity that's been observed internationally, with particular focus given that they're U.S. government documents on activity undertaken by the People's Republic of China and Russian Federation, but not solely. And so there they identify directed energy weapons, they identify co-orbital satellite killers, they identify weapons that might take advantage of radio frequency at either close proximity or from the ground. They identify cyber activity. And these are all questions of with what mechanism. But perhaps the most strategically relevant of all of the questions about characterizing the counterspace threat is the for how long question. And we're operating in an environment where there's a lot we don't know, right? There's much more open discussion about space capabilities and counterspace capabilities today than there was 10 years ago. But we're still operating in an environment where we have not seen large-scale conflict extend to space, nor have we seen conflict start in space and extend to the terrestrial environment. So we are theorizing in the absence of significant historical data. However, it appears from a great deal of expert conversation and from social scientific modeling, game theoretic approaches and the like, that there will be significant distinctions drawn between reversible and irreversible effects. I want to pull on that thread a little bit by analogy and talk a little bit about Cold War era intelligence gathering activity. Those of us that specialize and focus on the space sector sometimes fall victim to an excessive sense of the unique nature of space. As it turns out, the Cold War era saw both in space and in every other domain of great power interaction a whole continuum of conflict type activity. Let's talk just briefly about the intelligence sort of confrontation of the Cold War and think about the submarine forces which engaged, the US and Russian submarine forces, Soviet submarine forces, engaged in sustained competition that involved significant loss of life, not from direct attacks on one another, but from risk acceptant behavior and the course of that competition, right? Both the US and the Soviet Union lost numerous submarines, and the submarines' role in intelligence gathering, trailing one another, stalking, listening, observing, was extensive, right? And we accepted hundreds of human casualties in the course of that activity. We also warned each other off regularly and even bumped our submarines into one another underwater as we were jockeying for position, jockeying for advantage. Similarly, in the manned airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance realm, of course, the shoot down of Gary Powers and the U-2 was a key and seminal moment. Nations were invading one another's sovereign territory to gather intelligence, and eventually we agreed on treaties to provide for overt intelligence gathering over flight in order to monitor arms control. But we had military members killed in the act of gathering intelligence. We also did an enormous amount of jockeying for position, which continues up to the present, really, right? Nations fly around one another's perimeters, collecting electronic information, seeking to characterize activity. And we have high stress confrontations, again, at sea and in the air there. I think these parallels are worth thinking through, especially as we look at orbital counterspace and orbital intelligence gathering activity. We need to think through how we manage those crises. How did the US and China manage through the involuntary downing of the EP-3 not so many years ago? Right? How did we manage through that crisis and repatriate a crew? We may face similar, likely not human-involved situations in space in the not too distant future. These aren't war, right? These are something other than war, but they are conflict. And so the spectrum of conflict is going to be likely much broader than simply a binary we're at war or we're not. And I believe, and our initial analysis really does suggest that this spectrum will place a strong premium on reversible effects and on resilience against others seeking to produce reversible effects in space. I will say for the last 5 to 6 years in the US, the Department of Defense has had a very clear message that they're investing in increasing the resilience of space assets so that there is a consistent provision of space services to the forces, including many forces of US allies. They've had a consistent focus on improving space situational awareness, and that is particularly important in a partnership context, because if a potential adversary takes negative action against space systems, the ability to publicly characterize that action and make the negative behaviors visible globally will be key to mobilizing support, condemnation, and reinforcing the norms of non-interference or non-interference below certain levels. They've made significant efforts in increasing the efficacy of many of the space effects, PNT, comms, making them more jam resistant, more reliable in the face of others' attempts to produce negative effects or to interrupt services. So I think those are all positive steps, but underpinning all of that is this need for partnership. It is strongly in nations' interest to avoid a conflict that extends to space. The negative externalities that would be produced are extraordinarily high, and the ability to do so, I think, depends in part on presenting, wherever possible, a unified face to those that would seek to overturn that order. So I think that will be a great topic for further conversation today and for the rest of this conference, and I look forward to furthering the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. Now we'll have Martina Smuklarova, who's a senior fellow here at PSSI.
Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to present to you today the international legal framework related to counterspace threats and the possible reactive measures we have at our disposal. In fact, the qualification of the counterspace threat or action is the prerequisite for the identification of the legal boundaries of the response. Now I will introduce to you the main determining factors and principles, and later we can discuss particular questions in detail. The central determining element is whether the counterspace threat, be it kinetical physical, non-kinetical physical, electronic, cyber, including space hybrid operations, whether this counterspace activity is lawful, or whether it amounts to an international wrongful act. As concerns the first cluster, the lawful ones, it is important to know that we can lawfully react even to the legal counterspace threats or actions if we consider them disturbing or anyhow harmful. Here, we will have the right to resort to so-called retorsion. Retorsion, in light of international law, is a non-friendly, harmful act which is lawful, and it is a kind of a retaliation against an injurious activity of another state. The objective is to hurt the target, the state, its interest with the aim to modify its conduct. An example of typical retorsion that we will have at our disposal are, for example, various restrictions of diplomatic relations, visa policy, severance of economic or commercial cooperation which is not based in a treaty, especially in international trade, imposing higher tariffs on goods, custom policy, or even naming and shaming. All these measures we can activate in order to react to some harmful but lawful activity of our adversary. An example could be cyber operations that monitor data traffic patterns without causing damage, like, for example, data loss or extensive disruptions that don't amount to violation of some legal rule. Or, for example, possibly if we want to react to rendezvous and proximity operations, if we consider them lawful. So we also can impose these type of retorsions. As concerns the second cluster of counterspace threats, the unlawful ones, it means activities that violate international legal norms. Here, the situation is much more colorful, obviously, and the responding reactive measures that we have at our disposal are much more diverse. In this domain, from the legal point of view, the crucial point of division will be whether the counterspace threat or action reaches the threshold of an armed attack or not, in light of international law. If we can qualify the counterspace threat as an armed attack, so then rules of general international law of international security, UN Charter, namely Article 51, apply, and then we are entitled to resort to self-defense operation. Obviously, this situation in the specific geophysical conditions of space arena will raise lots of questions, lots of challenging legal questions that we have to address. An example, again, could be the use of anti-satellite weapon, whether direct ascent or co-orbital, that strikes a satellite or detonates a warhead near a satellite or ground station. So this would most probably qualify as an armed attack, which will give us the right to self-defense. If, however, those unlawful counterspace threats remain below the threshold of an armed attack, we still have important reactive measures at our disposal because these threats still violate certain international legal rules. So we'll be acting, we'll be replying, retaliating against an international wrongful act. Those norms might be a violation of prohibition to use force, which is different than violation of the prohibition of aggression. It's much broader. We have to distinguish this. Or, for example, a principle of sovereignty, or there might be some norms from other branches of international law, like international telecommunication law, international trade law, and so on, that might be at stake, yeah? That might be violated by these threats. In this situation, we will have the right to resort to countermeasures, so-called reprisals, in light of international law. Countermeasure is an act which in itself is illegal, unlawful. But since we adopt such a countermeasure in retaliation, in response for the commission of an earlier illegal act, I mean the counterspace act, threat, by another state, so then our reaction is validated in law under very strict conditions. We can talk about it later, but just to remind you, the legal regime of countermeasures is that countermeasure that we take has to react to a previous illegality. The non-performance of an obligation is only temporary. First, we have to issue a call to discontinue the wrongful act to the adversary. Proportionality principle obviously apply. Use of force is prohibited. Yeah? Countermeasures can't be military. We cannot resort to the use of force in this legal framework. And violation of peremptory norms, it means jus cogens, is also banned. Typical example of countermeasures that we can also apply in outer space are economic, financial, political sanctions, all embargoes, interruption of traffic, assets freeze, financial restrictions, travel bans that we impose on a state or on individually blacklisted people or entities, firms, fall within this category. When we transpose it to the space arena, so to give you an example, if our adversary proceeds, for example, to spoofing the downlink from a satellite and injects corrupted data into our national governmental communication systems without causing a serious damage, serious destruction, so if it won't amount to an armed attack, it will still be illegal. It might amount to violation of sovereignty, for example. So then it will give us the right to impose sanctions on that state or targeted entities. And finally, it is also important to mention that besides these various scenarios of unilateral right of each state target of a counterspace to adopt appropriate response, We also have at our disposal collective security mechanisms, at least theoretically. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter under the authority of UN Security Council that provides us even a much larger margin of action. So I hope that this general outline has elucidated the main boundaries of international legal regime, and I'm sure it gives rise to a lot of interesting and challenging legal questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Next, we have Shozu Takada, Director General, National Space Policy Secretariat at the Cabinet Office, Japan. Takada-san.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to make remarks on counter-space threats. My name is Shuzo Takada, Director General of National Space Policy Secretariat, Cabinet Office of Japanese Government. Regarding evolution of the counter-space threat, today I'd like to speak about 3 points. First is the necessity of strengthening SSA capability. Second is the importance of international partnership. The third is public awareness on this issue. Recently, we are heavily depending on space in our daily life. Without space, we cannot keep the current quality of life. Thanks to the recent technology development, space technology allows dramatic expansion of commercial space activities. In this course, there are many plans of mega constellations such as OneWeb, SpaceX, and so on. And now their plans are going on. As a result, the outer space becomes more and more congested. In this circumstance, risk of accidental collision on orbit, besides ASAT threat, is increasing. We need to take action to prepare such risks for ensuring the secure and sustainable use of outer space in the future. How to prepare? In order to protect our social system from the counter-space threat, we need to be more careful and aware of the risk of the threat. We should know the reality of the risk. How to know the risk? The answer is space situational awareness. In Japan's case, the government of Japan has been developed SSA capability since JAXA installed its optical scope for monitoring satellites and space debris in 2001. In addition, the new National Defense Program guideline was made in public last December. Based on the guideline, Japanese MOD is constructing deep space radar facility at the southern part of the main island, and it will start its operation from 2023. Ministry of Defense is also establishing a unit dedicated to space security. The second point is the importance of international partnership. Space situational awareness is not always easy. Japanese SSA capability is not enough to address the ongoing risk of space. In line with the increase of space bodies, the necessary effort to capture space situation will be more difficult. Now, partnership with like-minded countries and private sector is very useful and beneficial. Its importance becomes more and more increased. International collaborations enables richer database of space bodies. Besides database, improving the power of data analysis will strengthen our SSA capability. Japan has already had SSA cooperation agreement with the US, and we have started cooperation with France. Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, showed her strong interest to cooperation with JAXA on SSA. I believe strengthening international partnership is basic approach to the issue of increasing counter-space threats. The last key point is the importance of public awareness on this issue. The counter-space threat is an emerging threat. Government organizations are not good at changing for new issues. In order to strengthen capability to the threats, we need more sophisticated facilities and human resources. In Japan, We have been succeeded in increasing capacity recently, but I think it's not enough. Public awareness will contribute to fasten capacity building. For example, issue of space debris is becoming more familiar among some Japanese political leaders. I think talking about space debris will lead to getting attention to counter-space threats. In Japan, some members of parliament have become aware of the importance of SSA and supportive to enhance our capability. This year, Japan is the chair of G20 meetings. Japanese environment minister is willing to raise space debris issues after marine plastic debris issues. Environment issue is a little different character from counter-space threat issue, but I think it is better than nothing for increasing public awareness. The risk of counter-space threat is rapidly growing. We have to speed up our efforts in all fields, such as SSA capability enhancement, international partnership, and public awareness. I hope today's conference is a good opportunity to share the sense of urgency among all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takada-san. And last, we have Ashley Tellis, a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Let me start by thanking the Prague Security Studies Institute for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here in this august group. I want to make three main points in my remarks this morning. And the first point is a piece of bad news. I'm afraid counterspace activities will remain a growth industry for quite some time to come. And that is because most counterspace activities today are embedded in the realities of great power competition. Great power competition has returned to the international system with a vengeance. And both China and Russia, in particular, will pursue the development of a variety of counterspace programs and initiatives because they do share one simple objective, and that is to defeat US conventional military superiority and eventually dethrone the United States as the principal actor in the global system. Where China is concerned, there is an additional objective as well. China seeks to decouple the United States from its Asian allies, and therefore, I expect fully that China will continue to modernize its counterspace capabilities because it sees that as an integral component of its efforts to defeat US military superiority in Asia and beyond. That's the first point, and that's bad news. The second point, and I want to focus on China more than Russia today, because I think Chinese counterspace capabilities, especially in limited war scenarios, are serious possibilities because every limited war scenario that involves China has the potential to threaten the leadership and the stability and the survival of the Communist Party of China. In other words, even limited conflicts in Asia involving China have an impact on regime stability. And because they have an impact on regime stability, the threats to use counterspace in order to achieve Chinese political ends becomes pressing in many instances. Let me say a few things on this issue. It's interesting that although Chinese offensive counterspace investments are quite significant and growing, Chinese military doctrine does not make a fetish of counterspace operations. Rather, Chinese military doctrine focuses on achieving warfighting objectives terrestrially through the securing of information dominance. And counterspace becomes relevant only in the context of achieving information dominance. Having said this, however, Chinese doctrine affirms that offensive counterspace, especially if employed in the last resort, will have a disproportionate impact on China's ability to secure information dominance, and by extension, China's ability to defeat superior military forces that may be brought to bear. For this reason, if you look at the 4 reports that Mr. Moran referred to earlier, there is an extensive literature on Chinese investments in kinetic and non-kinetic instruments, in debris-causing and non-debris-causing instruments, and in instruments that create both transitory and permanent effects. All this is completely consistent with China's military strategy and its political objectives. And yet, having said this, I think China's investments in counterspace represent a very interesting dilemma for China. Because China does seek increasingly to use space for achieving its own strategic ends, even as it seeks to deny the United States unconstrained access to space. And so how does China balance its need for space in order to achieve its political ends with the necessity of preventing the United States from using space effectively to achieve American ends? I think this dilemma is going to be, managing this dilemma is going to be the central feature of Chinese military practices insofar as the interaction of space and information dominance is concerned for the foreseeable future. I would suggest that in the efforts to balance this dilemma, there are probably 3 conclusions that seem reasonable to me at this point. First, Chinese success in managing this dilemma will derive greatly from the delta between China's space denial activities, the space denial it can impose on the United States, and its own efforts at space control. So depending on how it manages its own efforts at space denial vis-a-vis its efforts at space control, the difference between those two will define China's success on the battlefield. Second, I imagine that China's success in limited conflicts will increasingly push China towards non-debris causing space denial operations. Because non-debris causing space denial offers it the ability to checkmate the United States while still maintaining a space environment that is relatively useful. This does not mean that debris-causing attacks will be forsworn, but I do think they will increasingly become weapons of last resort, used primarily for deterrence or when supreme political objectives are at risk. The third conclusion that I think is worth considering is that because counterspace is so important for Chinese efforts at information dominance, I expect that Chinese activities in counterspace will begin not simply during a conflict, but right from the beginning of conflict itself. In other words, Chinese strategy will not have space for gradual escalation, but rather would begin to use a variety of non-debris causing effects even before a conflict begins. All this leads to the conclusion that counterspace activities in the context of limited conflicts involving China and Russia as well will of course be serious affairs. What does the US do in this environment? And this is the third and last point that I want to make. The first thing that the United States needs to focus in partnership with its allies is achieving its desired political and operational objectives terrestrially, despite whatever an adversary may do in the realm of counterspace. This may seem counterintuitive. In other words, the US needs to focus on achieving its military objectives first, because it does the United States no good to have protected its space assets only to lose the military campaign on the ground. So the efforts to achieve one's military objectives must be primary, even in the context of pervasive counter-space operations. Second, the unilateral investments that the United States makes in reducing the vulnerability of its systems are likely to have the highest payoffs as the US prepares for a competitive space environment in the decades to come. But even the United States will not have the luxury of single-point solutions. Rather, I expect that the US needs to pursue 5 initiatives simultaneously. It needs to think seriously about limitations on counterspace that can be imposed through the use of diplomacy. It needs to think about how best certain space assets can be segregated from attack, especially command and control for strategic nuclear forces, if necessary through the mechanisms of arms control. It needs to think about protecting certain high-value, low-density systems that are extremely important and exist in low numbers. It needs to invest seriously in mitigation, essentially ways of diminishing the effectiveness of Chinese non-kinetic attacks on US systems. And last, it also needs to think about developing the requisite instruments for retaliation. That is, the ability to inflict lethal yet discriminate damage without making space more hostile for human purposes. In all these activities, the US increasingly will have to work with allies, both for political and for operational reasons. In fact, a very important dimension of the alliance relationship will be operational, because in the midst of crises and conflict, the US will need to rely increasingly on allied capacities in order to meet its own warfighting aims. As we think about the future of space and counterspace, it's important, I think, to be very realistic about the kind of environment that we are entering into, particularly in the context of great power competition. I don't think our national interests will require us to do any less. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Okay, we have about half an hour for a conversation with our panelists. I'm going to be opening it up to the floor for questions in just a few minutes, so be thinking of anything you want to ask these experts up here. But I'd like to start off using the power of the chair to ask my own question. Just kind of a big picture, kind of setting the discussion for the rest of the conference. If you guys were to say what you thought the most pressing counterspace threat is currently in present time, and then again what the most pressing counterspace threat would be in 5 years, what would that be? Who wants to start with that one? Everyone's looking away from me right now. Thoughts? Jamie.
So I think the gradation that I suggested up front is important. And in military planning, we tend to think about likelihood and consequence of various actions. And so it's unquestionably the case that extraordinary damage could be done to the space environment and to the ability of forces around the world to produce effects from space for terrestrial ends, as Ashley rightly talked about, with nuclear detonation in space. That's extraordinarily high consequence, almost impossible to mitigate the effects of it, but it's also, I think, quite unlikely, except in the context of an extraordinarily destructive war that would be an overwhelming and colossal fact, regardless of whether or not it extended to space. So that, I think that is, think about that in terms of most consequential, and it's available today, I think, to, with a reasonable amount of effort to major powers that have developed nuclear weapons. In general, though, the much more likely circumstances also available today, and I think increasing in the future, are these more reversible and tailorable effects, which could be carefully designed to send specific signals as to the ability of, say, Allied forces to halt aggressive action. And, a communication, denying a coalition the ability to communicate with forces at sea, for example, would send a profound message about the ability to organize and put together a coherent response in an Allied environment. That's why I think, especially on the U.S. Department of Defense side, but also across many of the allies represented here, these continued investments in resiliency of those kinds of capabilities are so important, and because they send a signal that the comparatively low threshold reversible activities will only deliver limited military outcomes and will not be decisive in and of themselves, which forces a potential adversary to think about taking a major, highly aggressive, non-reversible step if they're going to produce militarily relevant outcomes, and that's a much tougher choice. That's a much tougher choice for them to make.
Thank you. This is rather a political and strategic issue, so I'll try to reply from the legal perspective. I would say that the main challenge with respect to counterspace threats for us is to define the boundaries of legality, both on the sides of countermeasures, counterspace actions, counterspace threats, and our possible reactive measures, so that we can well prepare ourselves for the reactive mechanisms, norms of retaliation, countermeasures, or also preventive measures. So the definition of the legal framework. And here for us lawyers, we should focus both on the reinterpretation of existing international legal norms of general international law or space law or international security law, but also to identify possible new challenges that are not covered by existing law and that call for some new normative approaches. It can be via various codes of conduct, via various principles of confidency, transparency and confidence building measures, and so on, but simply to be well aware of the existing legal boundaries. Thank you.
My idea is almost equal to Mr. Morin. When we think about counter-space threat, probably the impact is as much as big as like a nuclear weapon, but the difficulty is the initial stage. Probably it would be a very gray zone, like a cyber attack. The attack will be reversible, like Mr. Morin said. So for the authorities, one of the biggest issue is how to define, how to understand the changing situation. That's the problem, I think.
Three thoughts on that subject. I think the threats to secure communications and PNT services that diminish the effectiveness of precision weapons is really the most important near-term threat as I see it. The second is, I don't think we understand well enough what the effects of offensive counterspace would actually be. And I suspect we will be in for many surprises in a wartime context, because people might think that even reversible and transient attacks have certain consequences, and they may be surprised that the second and third order consequences may be different from what they expect. And that leads me to the third point, that the possibilities of escalation are inherent in any counterspace game, because even if the attacks are transient and reversible, they have consequences for achieving operational aims. And no state is going to accept defeat of operational aims if it can do otherwise. And so the temptation to ratchet up the activities involved in counterspace, I think, remains a huge challenge, even in limited war scenarios.
Thank you. And then just building off of this, there's been a distinction made several times between reversal and irreversible threats. Is that the guiding line for counterspace in terms of which we say that is considered the most threatening? I know, Jamie, you've already had some thoughts on that, if you want to add on it. But for the rest of the panel, what do you guys think about that? Should that be the main consideration? And if so, how do you determine what is considered irreversible versus reversible? You know, if something is temporarily blinded, does that mean that it's still considered a usable asset, or is it considered to be something that's a vulnerability?
So I would be very interested to hear Martina's thoughts on emerging legal norms for, whether certain certain reversible actions rise to the level of an armed attack. And I think that's an area still in formation with respect to thinking about space. But I want to interject what I think is an important point here, which is we have become accustomed in the late 20th and early 21st century to an extraordinary degree of transparency in the midst of armed conflict. The battle damage assessment effort in various militaries to be efficient in the use of weapons are at a very high level, and the U.S. demonstrated a number of capabilities in the first Gulf War that really showed an efficiency of targeting. Specific targets struck once or twice and then fairly authoritatively assessed as destroyed. That's a completely different approach to earlier generations' experience of war, in which targets were struck over and over again in a variety of ways because of a great deal of fog and uncertainty. I think that scenario is much more likely to apply in space. If I seek to jam someone's satellite communications, it's not necessarily immediately clear to me how successfully I have prevented information from flowing. If I have jammed someone's PNT signal, I will know whether they were able to precisely strike me, but I won't necessarily know if that was because I was successful in jamming them or not. If I've fired some sort of laser at a satellite, it will not be immediately obvious whether I've degraded it, destroyed it, or missed it. And so I think we need to start wrapping our heads around much more uncertainty in assessing the effects that have been produced if counterspace weapons are actually employed, and think about that in terms of escalation dynamics. If one party knows that they have sustained some sort of irreversible damage, or they believe they've sustained it because they've lost contact with a satellite, how do they act in the intervening period before that effect maybe does go away? And so I don't think we've done a lot of theorizing around this yet, and I think we ought to help reduce the risk of misapprehension or miscalculation.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really good point in terms of, I think oftentimes we tend to think we have a much better situational awareness of what's going on in orbit than we actually do, and there's a lot of questions in terms of where assets are, much less if they're even working. So I think it's really important when policymakers are thinking about, as you say, externality effects of counterspace efforts, then it actually can be different than what actually was anticipated. So didn't mean to jump in there.
Thank you. So since you raised the issue, the element of irreversibility, so I might maybe connect it with another question, which is quite topical. It means, how do we define an armed attack, yeah, in the space arena? Because I said that in the domain of unlawful counter-space threats, the question is which of them achieve the level of an armed attack and which of them remain below the level of an armed attack. So what are the qualitative elements, and whether maybe the reversibility will play a role there, yeah? So here I have to reply in general. It means which counter-space threats could be qualified such as entering the scope, the framework of Article 51 of the UN Charter, which, as we know, is the normative basis for the state to activate its right to self-defense in reaction to an armed attack. I would say that in the space arena, both the conventional military attacks, such as anti-satellite weapons, but also non-kinetic, such as lasers, HPM, EMP weapons that produce physical effects on satellites or ground stations, as well as other interferences, have the potentiality to be qualified as an armed attack, but we don't have the reply yet. And we don't know yet the defined, accepted by states, criteria. I think that in general we can say that these possible questions, these possible counter-space threats will be judged similarly to cyber attacks on the basis of the doctrine, so-called effects-based doctrine, which is a new doctrine that we have already adopted in our neighboring domain, in a national cyber domain, that face the same challenges. It means that we will assess the qualification of the attack in light of the consequences and damages caused. The question is whether reversibility will play a role. It's up to us and the states to decide. Yeah? If a particular counter-space threat causes substantial harm and damages, the quantity and quality of which amounts to the destruction produced by a regular conventional armed attack. We will always make analogy, yeah, a parallel with the conventional armed attacks. For example, a deactivation of data signals that paralyze the functioning of a critical infrastructure, which might be reversible, maybe, of the state. If it causes significant damages, atrocities, destructions, the qualification as an armed attack might apply. In fact, public international law does not give us a legally binding reply, which are the criteria. Yeah? When we look at the case law of International Court of Justice, so in the famous Nicaragua case, ICJ only defined an armed attack as a force used on a large scale and producing significant effect. And it left it on the states, on international community itself, on the general agreement among states to define on a case-by-case basis, yeah, which of those are armed attack. Yeah. I just can refer as a last point to the General Assembly Resolution 3314, adopted in 1974, which gives us, in a non-legally binding way, very good examples of what armed attack means, yeah? And we can try to apply it to space. In all cases, it depends on us, since it is still a not precise, fine-tuned legal sphere. Thank you.
I'd like to jump in right here to do a brief advertisement for two efforts to do international humanitarian law discussions on the use of laws of armed conflict, how they apply to space. One is a Millamos manual and one is a Woomera manual. These are two complementary, hopefully, documents that are trying to figure out how laws of armed conflict apply to space, and my organization is involved in a certain extent in both of them. So we're hopefully in the next year or so, something will be coming out, TBD. We'll see what ends up coming in terms of useful stuff for the international arena. Anything else? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. All right, so we have a few more minutes. I'd like to open up to the audience, and we have an excited John Sheldon in the back. Could you guys please, when you're called on, a couple things. One, this is for attribution. Two, you are being filmed. Three, please speak into the mic because you're being filmed. Four, identify yourself in case you're not known. But John.
Thank you, Victoria. John Sheldon, Thor Group. I have a question for any of the panelists that would care to answer it regarding growing Sino-Russian cooperation which we have seen in the past year or so, has taken more of a military turn with Chinese participation in Vostok 2018. And at the last meeting between President Xi and Putin, we saw the participation of general staff from both countries as well. Are there circumstances in any future conflict where you might envision either country giving tacit or explicit counter-space support to each other? And how would we deal with that kind of scenario? It's one thing to talk about dealing solely with China or Russia, but how do we deal with both without unnecessarily escalating said conflict? And how does that relate also to, we talk about great power competition, what we're really talking about is the future of the Eurasian balance of power, and how does that relate? Thank you.
I think this is one of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with. And I suspect the extent of the intervention that the United States or its allies would engage in that scenario would depend on what kind of assistance the Russians are offering to the Chinese and vice versa. And you could have a European contingency involving Russia as the primary antagonist with China in support, or an Asian contingency where the roles are reversed. But I think it would really be a function of the effectiveness of the assistance that one offers to the other, and those are decisions that will be made in wartime. I think the threat of escalation acts as an important brake, so you have to be careful about how you respond, because if you have an active competition with one adversary, you certainly don't want to enlarge the scope of the conflict to include more adversaries. So there are things that you will do prudentially to deal with the problem, but I don't necessarily imagine that it would involve armed attacks on the third party.
All right,
Thank you, Victoria. Doug Lavero. I want to explore a little bit more what Martina was just talking about, and something that Ashley mentioned, and that is the second and third order effects of space activities. We oftentimes use these terms reversible and irreversible, and as space people, we're talking about the effect on the satellite or the space system as being reversible, but the effect on the user may or may not be reversible. So I want to understand from both a legal perspective and from a dynamic of escalation perspective, how we view that fact that what is reversible to the space side may not be reversible to the user side.
So I think an excellent question, Doug. Almost definitionally, reversible effects are, at least in time, not reversible to the user, otherwise they're not effects. And so there's a reason that even reversible counterspace effects are viewed as pretty serious. If I deny your PNT or your communications at a vital moment in a military activity, or a vital moment in a civilian emergency services circumstance, there are very real on-the-ground consequences to that. Who's liable if in a humanitarian intervention of some sort a weapon is employed, and due to PNT jamming, it runs into a target it wasn't intended to hit? Is it the nation that released the weapon, or the nation that spoofed or jammed the PNT and maybe resulted in a bomb impacting a hospital instead of a military target? Those are very real effects on the ground due to counterspace activity, and almost certainly will be actual practical questions that we'll have to deal with down the road should we have the employment of counterspace effects in the context of an armed conflict.
Just a quick complement to already what we have said. In terms of lex lata, it means existing positive law. We don't have any explicit legal norm with respect to use of force or definition of armed attack related to reversibility or irreversibility. Yeah? So lex lata, we don't have it. We might maybe need to create it, yeah, with respect to space arena and the distinction of various circumstances and levels, as you said, satellite and end users, yeah. But as concerns current international legal state of affairs, we don't have, yeah. The terms that we operate with is, as I said, consequences, effects of the operations, and surrounding circumstances, yeah. These are the terms that figure in ICJ judgments, and even now, when I explored our neighboring domain, our colleagues' efforts in the international cyber domain, I didn't find any element of reversibility being qualified as a determining factor. Yeah? In the cyber domain, for example, the Tallinn manual, they refer to criteria like severity, immediacy, invasiveness, directness, etc. But with respect to severity, they refer to scope, duration, intensity of consequences, yeah? So this is the current state of affairs, which, as I said, it does not prevent us to define some specific elements for the cyber domain. Thank you.
If I could just build real quickly on that. We don't have to look as far as cyber, right? In traditional conflict, an invasion is a reversible act. Right? The fact that my troops have crossed a border into your territory, maybe they kill no one. If they leave 3 days later, that was still an attack, right? So these are not completely new.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't have a direct answer to Doug's question, but I like to point out that in order to keep the level of service, I think the idea of mission assurance is quite important. So we need to check the space systems, not only asset-based, but also in terms of mission assurance, I think.
That's a great point, Doug. The point I wanted to make was that we should not be soothed or lulled into some sort of complacency because these effects are transient, because they will have operational consequences. And once you're involved in conflict, you have certain operational aims that you have to satisfy. And no matter the degree of transience, if it frustrates operational aims, you are going to react, and that has consequences. And where those consequences take you is impossible to sort of foresee a priori. But the point is we have to factor that in to our calculations of risks when we get into this business. So ideally what we want is to make certain that deterrence holds robustly so that we never bring these things to the test. But once the door is opened, I really don't have the confidence that we will be able to maintain the thresholds that we would like to see, even if we can theoretically identify thresholds.
Hi, Cassandra Steer from Women in International Security Canada, and I'm also here on behalf of Space Strategies Consulting. So I have a question that is, I guess, partly for Martina, although you've already pointed out, I think there is no legal definition in answer to this question, so maybe it's more of a policy question for the others, which is what do we do when a commercially owned satellite or commercial service is the victim of an attack? At what point do we consider that to be a breach of sovereignty? At what point might it be, for instance, if it's simply a breach of the ITU protections, the right to no harmful interference if a satellite and its services are dutifully registered, at what point would we or should we consider that that is something for a state to then retaliate against or intervene?
Yes, it's my question. Thank you very much. It's a very important issue, obviously, because we have to work both with a public and private perspective of ownership of satellites, and all of them can become a target of counterspace threats. So how does the legal regime differ? If a damage is caused to a private asset, yeah, to a space asset. So we have to distinguish where the space asset is located. Yeah, whether it is on the territory of a state as a ground station, for example, or whether it is a satellite, a platform in an international legal zone, it means on the orbit, in outer space. If the private asset is located on the territory of a state, then the situation is easy, yeah? Because we very well know that the principle of sovereignty, principle of jurisdiction, that obviously plays a very important role in the space arena, is covers, it means that states enjoy a sovereign authority with regard to any infrastructure, cyberspace, persons and activities located and performed within its territory. So any attack on some of these elements located within its territorial jurisdiction is considered as an attack against that state. Yeah? So we could legally argue that the attacker violated, if it does not achieve the level of armed attack, which is not excluded, but if it's below the threshold, we can talk about violation of state sovereignty. And the state itself has the right to retaliate via the countermeasures, for example, as I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah? The situation is different if, however, the satellite will be, if you talk about satellite, yeah, it means a space private asset which is on the orbit. That's obviously more difficult. We don't have an answer yet. You don't find a positive law with respect. We just can apply various analogies. I looked at the Tallinn manual, how they dealt with a similar issue, because they were, again, facing the same legal challenges like us, with respect to cyber infrastructure that might be located in some international zones. For example, high seas, international waters. And I was a little bit surprised that there it is noted, and I can even cite it for you, that operation against cyber infrastructure located on the high seas or international airspace that does not enjoy sovereign immunity or inviolability, which means a governmental or state infrastructure, such as privately owned aircraft that provides internet access, does not generally constitute a violation of sovereignty because it's not located on the territory of the state. Yeah? It means that the state won't be able, yeah, to strike back and invoke an international wrongful act. However, there might be other norms of international law that are at stake, like international trade law, international telecommunication law that we could operate with. Yeah? But still, we have Article 8 of Outer Space Treaty that, as we know, state party on host registry and object launch into outer space is carried shall retain jurisdiction and control over that object, which we might try to use as a legal argument. So again, it's up to us to decide. But I just would like to highlight that we should not forget that governmental and private satellites, even if they are located in an international zone, they enjoy immunity and inviolability. So there we talk about violation of sovereignty. Thank you.
So I guess the short version is it depends, right?
Sorry?
It depends, yeah.
On the circumstances.
Yes. Such a lawyerly response. We're getting really close to our coffee break, but I'd just like to give our panel the opportunity, if you had like one sentence takeaway you wanted people to come from your remarks or your thoughts on the evolution of counterspace threat, what would that be? Who wants to start? If you have a one sentence takeaway on what you want people to take from your remarks, or if you really want to foot stomp one idea, what would that be?
Well, things are going to get a lot worse before they get better.
Who wants to follow that?
I would just note that the domain is evolving rapidly in ways that open new questions, but I actually think a lot of the necessary steps to address that and to deter conflict are already being taken. So I think we've made more progress than we perhaps give ourselves credit for.
I think the issue, counterspace threat, I'm sure this is really changing day by day. And year by year. So exchanging views among like us is quite informative and crucial, I think. Thank you very much.
Martina?
Thank you. I would say think about the law and be encouraged to participate at its progress.
Great. All right, well, please join me in thanking the panel, which has been a fascinating discussion on the evolution of counter space threat.